Hi, Rachel. Welcome back.
Hey Lars, it's great to be back.
Yeah, 2020, right?
Yeah, what a year it has been and still
Seriously.
continues to be.
And it's unfolding as we speak. We are recording this at the end of October, and arguably October, from the astrological standpoint, has been probably the most turbulent thus far.
Hmm.
Happy we're here and we're able to help the people with another square video.
That's right. Yeah. I think the more we can make sense of the positive aspects of squares and challenging transits, the more we can gracefully glide through these last few months
Of
of 2020.
2020. Yeah, for
Yeah.
sure. So let's go ahead then, because we're going to give the people what they want. And what they want is another square video for sure.
Yeah.
When I was looking back at our archive or our, discography thus far, videography, I realized that we didn't touch Mercury or Jupiter squares. So why
Mm.
not talk about the square to each other?
I love it. Yes.
So this is the Mercury square Jupiter taking the scare out of the square, featuring us. And I think it's important to note that, like, yes, I think probably why we actually have stayed away from Jupiter squares is that they're not always as scary as a square to Saturn or a square to Pluto or, if Mars is involved, right?
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, I mean, Jupiter is the greater benefic.
Mm-hmm.
And so often Jupiter wants to give you wants to bring good things into your life. But when it's in a square aspect, often the biggest challenges you'll face are just overwhelm, too much, too fast, kind of like you have to rein it in. Any kind of Jupiter square, you have to grab the reins and try to take hold of that influence.
100%. And that's what we're going to be diving into. But typically, you just talked about that aspect, right? The
Mhm.
square aspect, which, if you look back at like the OG astrologers like Ptolemy or Nicholas Culpeper, for example, all of them didn't have nice things to say about squares, which sort of set the stage for why in 2020 people are discovering astrology, looking at their chart, and then crying over their squares. But we are here to say that you should not fear your squares, because squares are aspects of our personality that we're just refining over time, right?
Mhm. Yeah, and very often the tension that you experience with a square is something that as you move through it, it actually becomes a gift. And so it creates the opening for an opportunity for some kind of success in overcoming that challenge you get to experience.
Totally. And typically, I have found there are some primary keywords to associate with squares. Of course, it depends upon the bodies involved in that 90 degree, but restlessness and doubt are typically two primary keywords. I would associate, just like I know we're going to touch upon, restlessness is a big Jupiter square keyword, whereas doubt wouldn't necessarily be as much for Jupiter. But if it's a Saturn square, we're going to really be feeling that doubt.
Absolutely. And squares too, I think another key word that we could add that you have here on the list is tension. If you think about a square is a 90-degree angle. And I think in a previous video we talked about this, how walls, like if you look at any framework for a house or a structure or a building, you're going to have a 90-degree angles, and the tension that's created from those 90-degree angles allows something to have structure and stability. You can also think about this in terms of gravity. Like we are standing 90 degrees
Mm-hmm.
from the earth. We walk upright. And so we're always having a tension of being stuck to the earth and also rising above. And that tension allows us to get to where we want to go.
Mm-hmm.
But it's not always comfortable. And often squares in our charts can represent where over time we might experience health issues because of gravity and the way that gravity works, and because of the way that we hold ourselves in our bodies on the earth.
Right, 100%. And I mean, when you brought that up, that past video, it blew my mind, because thinking about it, a house is so fundamental to just how we, live our life and stuff, but that house is sitting on those 90-degree angles. I also realized when I do this, I can feel some tension here
Yeah.
versus if it was a trine or if it
Right.
was like a sextile or something, right? Like you can feel the tension at the perpendicular angle, which is the square is, but that tension is a useful condition in order, to unlock potential for
Mm-hmm.
sure. In addition to that, another great example of tension being a useful condition is stretching. Sometimes
Yeah.
the square isn't, they're not going into each other at a 90-degree, but they're trying to stretch at a 90-degree.
Yeah.
And stretching is sort of what keeps our body healthy. Like it definitely hurts when you are stretching your hamstring, but then you find that you have more flexibility as a result.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I love that. I love that analogy. You know what else is fun? This, my wife and I just did this. We have a round table, a round dining room table, and or kitchen table rather. And we were like, let's play out the different aspects in how we sit and see like how does it feel? Like how
Interesting.
does it feel when we sit in a sextile? How does it feel when we sit in an opposition? And if anyone's watching this and you want to really like viscerally experience the aspects, doing this exercise is really it really is revealing, because when you're sitting at a at a 90-degree angle, when you're sitting at a square, you can actually kind of feel the tension.
So crazy.
It's like your body's aiming forward, but it has to move slightly. It's interesting, but it's an exercise that I think all astrologers should play with.
100%. Next partner I have for sure. I will only have a square kitchen table. And for those at home who want the definition of the Ptolemaic aspects, so
Mm-hmm.
you're saying it would be an opposition of 180
80
degrees and a
degrees,
square of 90 degrees.
or trine of 120 degrees,
Hmm.
and a sextile of 60 degrees.
Okay. Did you
And
do the
then,
conjunction? Did you sit on each other's laps?
no, we actually did sit really close, yeah.
Yeah.
And then, we tried the quincunx. We tried some of the minor aspects
Okay,
too.
like
But
150 and stuff.
yep,
That's so great. I love that.
yeah.
Well, if you at home try this, please comment below. We
Yes.
we would love to hear from you guys about that. Cool. Anything else about why squares are scary?
One thing I will say is that people who have a number of squares in their charts tend to be very successful. If you look at the chart of Steve Jobs, for example, some very prominent squares, because you're not afraid of hard work. You're not afraid of doing what's necessary to move beyond your own limitations. And so, so you have here that the tension is useful, and very often you'll find that. So own your squares.
Love
They
it.
are gifts. They truly are.
They are. Just view it as a Rocky montage, right? Like that's really what it is. And I think one last thing that we want to touch upon, especially given the fact that Mercury is involved here, is that by progression, the square can age out. Your square can grow through progression, and sort of it can ease the tenseness, or it just might become more workable. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
Versus, and that's going to happen since this is Mercury involved, for before the first Saturn return for sure, the square is going to feel real square like, but I imagine after about 35 years by progression, unless there's some retrograde that occurred, it's likely that square will soften.
Right. Yeah, that's a really good point. And for those of you who don't know what progressions are, or who haven't worked with them, it's a way of advancing your chart where a day after your birth equals a year in your life. So every planet moves at a different rate, and often what happens is that your progress chart shows a reflection of where you are and what you've learned based on where you came from and what's indicated in your natal chart.
100%. And so the reason why I bring up retrograde for that is that I'm born natally with Mercury retrograde, that still had about, I think it had 18 days left of it or something, meaning that for the first 18 years, my Mercury was retrograde by progression, and then it's stationed direct. And so then I still had time to make up that way, meaning that this square, if I had Mercury square Jupiter natally, it would take a lot longer to age out than someone who just had Mercury direct for a while.
Mm-hmm.
Great. And if you want more information about progressions, we recommend working with an astrologer. And maybe next year we'll do a couple of videos on it.
Yeah, definitely.
Well, let's get to the first player in the equation. It is Mercury with those winged shoes. Do you want to start?
Sure. Well, Mercury is the planet of the mind. It's the planet of communication. I like to say, I'm skipping down a little bit, but I like to think of Mercury as your inner voice.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not necessarily like you're the voice of your inner critic, but it's more of like, how do you talk to yourself? What does that voice sound like? What kind of things are you focusing on are getting your attention?
Amen. And I think tied to that are attitudes that we hold, for sure, especially when Mercury's squared by anything. That, just like that inner voice and that inner dialogue is really going to be affected. Mercury square Pluto is one we could totally do and really zero in on the inner voice or the inner dialogue for sure, and also the attitudes. But Mercury square Jupiter, those attitudes are definitely going to be affected through Jupiter's sort of tendency to make things big.
Mm-hmm. Definitely, yes. Mercury is also your siblings, and it's your neighborhood and local community.
Mm-hmm. I also find with Mercury, just like I discussed with the progressions aspect of it, it's important to like take an assessment and look at if Mercury is retrograde natally, since that's definitely going to affect all of those keywords that we've just used for Mercury and sort of your outlook on that. Also, I think about from the inner dialogue standpoint, natal Mercury retrograde might connect the dots in a not go like 1, 2, 3, 4, thinking that that's the most simple way, but might say like, why not go 1, 5, and then go all the way back from 4 to 1?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, it's an outside the box thinker often.
Yes.
And I'm pretty sure Ruth Bader Ginsburg was born with natal Mercury retrograde.
And I'm in company.
Yes, you are. You're in good company. But you can see with people who have this that they might not be the traditional learners. You might learn how to talk in a different way. You might actually have something wrong with like a tongue tie or something going on with your mouth that makes it so that you have to think in an expanded way. Or there can sometimes be a delay where you're really shy. And then by progression, when that goes direct, you come out as having like being an extrovert when you've been an introvert for all of those years that Mercury was retrograde in your progressed chart.
Well, you don't know this about me, but actually growing up, I did have a speech issue when I was younger, which resulted in me being pretty shy. I had trouble with my S's. And so that actually made me very self-conscious and shy. And then 18, I think, or 19 is when my Mercury by progression was direct. And I discovered stand-up comedy within a year of that.
Amazing.
And from that, I really became an extrovert and filled up a room with my voice.
I love it. I love it. And Lars, I hear stories all the time from people, from clients and from people, other people who have this influence where it's the same thing, where it's like I was really shy and then all of a sudden I became really popular, or all of a sudden I stood up on stage.
Exactly. And so I think, especially given the fact that Mercury is retrograde 3 times a year, it's why I just wanted to draw attention to it. Mm-hmm. I think that, that would just be something to pay attention to if the square does involve, natal Mercury retrograde.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Anything else that you want to touch upon with Mercury?
Sure. Your Mercury tells you a lot about how you learn. Like, for example, someone with a fixed sign Mercury, it might take you a little bit longer to learn something, but once you do, you retain it. So learning, memory, even though memory is also tied to the moon, these are all things that we look at when we look at Mercury.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. And I think when you talk about memory being tied to the moon, there's like the emotional memory versus kind of like factual recall, right? And so would you say that factual recall would be more so Mercury, whereas the emotional memory would be more the moon?
Definitely. And I think it depends too on so we talked about Mercury retrograde. If Mercury is retrograde in your chart, your Mercury is going to be slow. And there are other times when Mercury moves really fast. So someone with a fast Mercury might be able to learn things and catch on pretty quickly. Someone with a slower Mercury might take a longer time to integrate that like new knowledge or new information coming in. So Mercury really tells you a lot about how you're going to do in school. You know, I like to think of Mercury being that the planet that most closely relates to us when we're in elementary school, because it's talking about how we're getting along with people, what kind of small talk we can make, how we're learning, what we're interested in, what books we like to read, all of those kinds of things.
For sure. Yeah, I think that's a really, really great point, especially since, you know, these squares, I imagine our audience is an adult audience, but they may have kids with this square as well, or they may have kids every kid has a Mercury in their chart somewhere. So definitely, you know, an important thing to look at if you're analyzing the chart of a child.
Mm-hmm, definitely.
Great. So let's go on ahead to me. I am a Sun,
Jupiter,
Moon, Pisces rising. So, you know, triple Jupiter ruled in my mind. Some people ascribe Neptune to be the ruler of Pisces, which I could say co-ruler, but nonetheless, Jupiter is very influential. And my favorite part about Jupiter is going, you know, I'm not going to go out of order with my Mercury retrograde here, but the optimism or the anything is possible kind of mindset that strong Jupiter in a chart can bring.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Yeah, Jupiter is the planet of expansion. So, you know, I always like to think of Jupiter and Saturn together because Jupiter is the biggest planet in the solar system. And you know, so it's got this like real prominent presence, and it would keep going, but Saturn is like right there kind of holding an orbit, keeping a boundary.
Yes.
So so often that Jupiter aspect of ourselves is the aspect that wants to go big or go home,
Yes.
that doesn't want to play small or hold back or constrict.
Mm-hmm. I love that you use the term boundaries because that's not any Jupiter doesn't know what that does. You know, a Google search in Jupiter's mind would not come up with any hits if you type in boundaries in the Jupiter means for
Exactly.
sure. You know, and in addition to that, Jupiter tends to augment what it touches. You know, so if we're talking about Mercury here, you can imagine that it's going to really blow up those keywords we just discussed. Now, Jupiter itself represents our belief systems and our philosophies. So important to integrate that and to put some tension with that keyword and whatever other planet that it's touching.
Mm-hmm, definitely. And I think this is why this is why it's the planet of higher education. It wants an expanded worldview, or to grasp a worldview in general. It also relates to international travel and exploration of other cultures, other places. It's the planet of adventure.
Yes. Definitely, for sure. I mean, I feel like you're reading my resume because I lived abroad before I was 21. I have my master's in higher education management. So, like, you're talking to Mr. Jupiter here, and I'm like ticking off all the big Jupiter boxes for sure. I think one thing that's really important to note and why Sag gets this reputation, Pisces in a different way. I think Pisces kind of gets the daydreamer kind of reputation more so, but it is kind of a form of restlessness or escape or like the need to like change things up. Jupiter really can cause restlessness.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and I think that's one important thing to rein in when Jupiter is squaring anything in a chart is like finding the root causes of that restlessness and satiating it, because a hard Jupiter square that is never really wrestled with can definitely lead to someone who just never really settles, just as continue like Sag gets the shadow trait of being the nomad in a negative way, and like it can lead to nomadicism a bit.
Mm-hmm, definitely. Or like commitment in relationships can be something that's a real struggle. There's always a tension between freedom and commitment to a job, to a person, to a house,
Right.
things like that.
And this is sort of where when we talk about the actual square and just more generally, like we're talking about one specific aspect, but aspects are mitigated by other aspects. And for me, as an example, like the tightest square in my chart is Sun square Jupiter. So what you're just describing with sort of commitment and restlessness, I resonate with. But then I have Venus at 0 degrees in Scorpio square Saturn. So when it comes to commitment, like, that's something that I can do, more innately because of the mitigation between squares.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a really good point. That we are isolating these squares and we're isolating these aspects, but you always want to approach the chart as a whole.
Yeah.
And for you, Lars, do you find that you play a tug of war between those two squares? Yeah.
Definitely, right? And I think, I'm having my Saturn return in 6 weeks, and it's really been like this year has been a year in which the integration has really started to flow with Saturn making its ingress into Aquarius a bit, me starting to really feel like that Saturn return a bit. I've had also a few trial runs. I think the big way that people with squares learn to mitigate and learn to unlock the potential of their squares through crashing and burning or through, pain has perfect timing.
Yeah.
And definitely, I think, I'm coming to the point where it's less of a tug of war and more of a mitigation or an integration. And this is what I definitely recommend people do with this is like, watch these videos to really understand the core structure of the square, but then look to see what the outs are. Like what else is the Jupiter or the Mercury in your chart related to that might be either further inflaming the situation or like making it tougher to deal with, or possibly, you have a couple of trines from Mercury somewhere else. That could be the out.
Yeah, yeah. Or trines or sextiles can very, very often be can show additional opportunities within
Yeah,
the square.
definitely. Cool. Do we want to talk about the
Yeah.
star of the Mercury square Jupiter
Yeah,
show?
true.
So we both decided that definitely, like, above all else, John McEnroe would be ideal Mercury square Jupiter like person to talk about.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. He's such a good representation of how you can actually see this aspect play out in real life. I mean, I think even the fact that he's a tennis star,
Yeah,
you
totally.
know, I always I always think of tennis as being very much of like a Mercury type of sport. And you know more about this than I do, just because you play tennis because you're in this world. But I mean, you're talking about hitting balls in the air
Right.
with a racket. So I think even his line of work and the fact that that he travels so much for his work, and
Yeah.
he's never in one place at one time.
Definitely. And like you also speak to it being a Mercury sport, and it's considered to be one of the most mental sports. It's a solo sport. And I think he actually said that it's 80% mental, 20% physical. So,
Wow.
Mercury would be the perfect planet if it's a mental sport for sure. So you and I came up with this list of things to talk about. He embodies, I think, both shadow, Mercury square Jupiter, and you start as a pro tennis player when you're really young, when he was pre-Saturn return. So we really saw him wrestling with his Mercury square Jupiter. And in his older age, he has come to embody some more high-minded virtues of it as well and unlock the potential behind it. But, I think for me, I definitely touch upon making mountains out of molehills and choosing your principles over the fact of the matter, for sure, being like two big Mercury square Jupiter things to look out for.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. It can also be someone who, when we're talking about Mercury and Jupiter, we're talking about truth versus belief.
Mm-hmm.
And often what can happen with someone when someone has this aspect natally is that you can own something as true. You can own one of your beliefs or one of your opinions as true, and it can be very easy to fixate on that to where you feel like you have a need, like an internal drive to get other people to believe what you believe, and you don't want to change your mind
Yeah,
very often.
100%. And speaking of that with McEnroe, important to note that McEnroe has Jupiter in its domicile of Sagittarius at 0 degrees, a critical degree of Sagittarius, square Mercury, I believe, in Aquarius And I believe Jupiter's in his third house as well. So
Mm.
when we're talking about the house that's related to communication, there's definitely that. I really like what you're talking about with kind of what they take as true, since that's really the case, unfortunately. Like we talked about, Jupiter is your belief systems, and Mercury is your mindset, your worldview. And when they're in tug of war with each other, sometimes what you think is true and like what really is the fact of the matter are two different things. And we see this with him when he's arguing with the umpire a lot. They can show a replay on the television screen of whether that ball was in or out. And he is so affirmed in what he saw and what he believes. And we see the actual replay showing that he's wrong, but he is still going to say, "Are you kidding me?" Going to slam a racket, which is very not, it's not a very, it's not what you're supposed to be doing. But everything kind of then just gets a little overabundant, if you will. And there's another sort of layer to the Mercury square Jupiter.
Mm, mm. Yeah, that is such a good example. To no matter what anyone's telling him, or what
Right.
the actual video replay is showing,
Yeah.
in his mind, what he saw is right.
Totally. Like the camera footage was doctored on its way to being shown to the public. Like, I don't know what he's thinking, but he is still arguing about it. And one thing that I also want to talk about is, for those of you out there who are working with squares or just other aspects, Sue Tompkins has a great book called Aspects in Astrology, one that I have used for years. And she writes that this aspect can be associated with misunderstanding, either due to overenthusiasm or just like jumping the gun and assuming wrong.
Mm-hmm.
So there is sort of the sense of like not necessarily being settled and listening. I think, Mercury square Jupiter can result in someone who, when they are in their principles or affirmed in their view, they're not going to be listening.
Mm-hmm. Right. Which I think, on the positive, this is someone who can be extremely persuasive.
Yes.
And one example I'm thinking of that is and I don't know if this is how he is in real life, but Hugh Grant is
Mm-hmm.
another person who has this. And in his romantic comedy movies, there's always a scene where he's trying to convince someone that he's a good person, or that he's like, that he they should be with him, or it's like there's always a moment where it's like, no, we should be together.
Love Ashley
um,
100 times. So
yeah.
exactly.
So this is a real gift that comes with this influence. I mean, this is a speechwriter. This is someone who could actually write really great fiction, or who could be a great teacher, because of the ability to take that Jupiter energy of optimism and enthusiasm and passion and theatrical ability, and translate that and focus that into a very specific Mercury way.
I love that you bring that up, because in using John as an example, in his old age, actually within the last 2 years, this is very much post Saturn return. He actually has used his innate ability to be this like benefic orator, which he is, very impassioned orator, to speak out against Margaret Court and her very homophobic views in the tennis world, and really try to, as a straight ally, bring LGBT equality in tennis to the forefront, which is something that no other player of his stature has done yet. And Margaret Court is a 24-time major slam champion. She won those majors a really long time ago, but nonetheless, she has a voice in the space and is using it to hurt others. And he, took it upon himself to use his incredible ability with his innate Mercury square Jupiter to speak out against her and really kind of like shine light on the importance of equality in sport.
Wow, that is incredible. I didn't know that about him.
And you wouldn't think it, because what we have in our mind is the young McEnroe who has kind of the shadow vibes of Mercury square Jupiter, but really you can grow into such a potent and powerful orator. Just communicator you're talking about with writing, through reading lines. Virginia Woolf, we talked about, also has this flair, and thinking about her writing and how influential it's been. and stood
Uh-huh.
the test of time.
Yeah. And, you know, other actors like John Travolta, you know, he just has this career that's all about being, that's like, you know, it's been a career of playing different characters, being different people for different, you know, in different roles, and
Some
going
of
from
the most
everything.
iconic characters I can think of, like
Yeah,
fiction, and
exactly.
yeah, definitely.
And being very outspoken for things that he believes in too. So, and I think he's an example of someone who's really been able to hone this gift and use it in a very theatrical way.
Yes, definitely. Important to note, if you were to look up a list of Mercury square Jupiters, there's going to be a lot of actors on that list,
Yep.
for sure.
Yep.
You're going to see mostly actors. You will see some politicians and a couple of athletes. I
Mm-hmm.
think because of the, like you're talking about, the mercurial nature of tennis, that's why John McEnroe is like the prime athlete for this. But for sure, yeah, just the ability to use your gift of gab.
Mm-hmm.
As a career move or to persuade others is like really where the strength lies in the square.
Yeah, definitely.
Awesome. Cool. Did you want to touch upon anything else? I think that, we really
I
sort of,
think we covered it. I think we really did cover it. Yeah.
I think, like, just to close, I hope that anyone watching this isn't like too down in the dumps on their Mercury square Jupiter. I can't imagine many people, like Sun square Jupiter, for example, is my tightest aspect, and it has not haunted me in the way that Venus square Saturn has. I
Mhm.
do think that foot and mouth disorder is something I have struggled with throughout my life, which with Mercury square Jupiter, I hope that, people learn to take a breath, and there's a difference between reacting and responding, and choosing to respond instead of react.
Mhm. Yeah, I love that.
Yeah, so thanks so much for joining us.
Yes. Yeah, thank you. And this has been so great. I always love doing these videos with you. It's always fun
Totally.
to explore these squares and to help people to take the scare out of their square.
Exactly. And we'll be back next year probably, because you're going to be on a little bit of a sabbatical.
Yes.
Um, and
Giving birth to a Scorpio.
yeah, that requires your full attention for sure. But we look forward to continuing these in 2021. And yeah, this will be out soon.
Great. Yeah.
So we'll see you soon, everyone.
All right.
Bye.
Bye.